So our next speaker is Tim Nelson. Tim wears a multitude of hats in the energy sector, but is one of those people in the energy sector who is very, very highly regarded for both his economics knowledge, but also his energy economics knowledge and how that all applies in the broader sector. So if you do end up working in the sector, Tim is someone that everyone looks to with very, very high regard. So he's going to give us an energy market outlook. With your Griffith University hat on today, is that right?
Yeah, but feel free to ask me any questions. All right, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I've got a lot of slides which I'll make available after today. But each year I do this just to kind of frame in my own mind what the energy market's looking like. And the key things that I'm going to talk to is the big picture. What are we talking about long term? Really importantly, though, what drives electricity prices? Because you get lots of different views about what electricity prices look like. I'll go through some data to actually kind of unpick that a little bit. State-by-state analysis of supply and demand. Who here lives in New South Wales? Yeah, look, get onto your local MP and tell them to build some pump hydro batteries sometime soon. Some observations around networks and retail markets. And then I'm going to be really controversial and talk about CFDs, contracts for difference, because they've become the flavour of the month. And what I'm going to put to you is that the buyers and sellers of those don't understand what they're doing. And I'll come back to why that is. So the big picture, significant change being driven by government policy. So we're seeing all of this new entrant investment coming in. This goes out to 2044. This is just a model that we run in Plexos. And you can see a lot of it's rooftop PV, but then we've got a lot of wind, a lot of large-scale solar. So all of that in regional communities, which means social licence is going to be really important. But you can see we've got huge amounts of pumped hydro coming through. Australia hasn't built any pumped hydro for decades. So, what's the cost to that? I wish I knew. You've got lots of batteries coming in. But the other technology, which I think is really important, is what I would call clean fuel generation technology. So, biodiesel, green hydrogen, ammonia. All of the OEMs are promising that by 2025, they'll have commercially available turbines that run on ammonia and hydrogen. And I'll come back to why I think that's really important a bit later on.
Sorry, Kim, you can't move. Well, 2023 rooftop solar number.
Yes.
You reckon 7 or 8 gigs this year?
I think that this is a function of the model, that it might be including last year's as well, I think. I don't know. I'd have to go.
You'll be excited. That'd be enormous. That'd be the world leading.
Yeah.
So I'll come back to why I think solar PV is such a money for jam investment a bit later on when I talk about retail. But to your point, if you don't have solar PV, jump into it. Yeah. This is the other side of the story, all of the plant that's coming out of the market. The reason that I put this up is that all of this plant historically has provided a whole bunch of free services around frequency, around inertia, around system strength, all those things. Those markets are going to boom. So understanding the technical characteristics is really, really important of all of these different types of technologies. What drives electricity prices? The first thing that I'd say is that you need to understand what demand looks like, and you can't understand demand without understanding solar PV. Australia has by far the most solar PV of anywhere in the world when you consider population dynamics and all of those types of things. But this is what it's done to demand. And this is such a cool chart. So around the world, this is called the duck curve. You can see that this is demand in South Australia over a 24-hour period. And you've got all of the years from 2010 to 2022. And what it basically means is you started up here and then you ended up down here, because all of that solar behind the meter is carving out demand. The reason that this is such an important part of the story, in South Australia this year, around 20-25% of all pricing periods will be negative. So, basically you're being paid to use energy at those times during the day. The other key thing about South Australia as a really good example is residual demand. Once you think about all of the demand that occurs once all of the variable renewables have happened, it's starting to get to the point where in the middle of the day, the system can't cope with it. So what does that mean? Batteries. If you think about the opportunity in South Australia, you're basically buying energy into your battery. You're, in many cases, negative pricing, actually being paid to train your battery, and then you can deploy it back here. So what do I see as the immediate opportunity for people kind of right now? Putting a battery. It's such a money for jam exercise. The key thing, though, that drives prices in the long term is entrance withdrawals. And you can see in this chart, this has got the price of New South Wales electricity. That's obviously a bit of an unusual observation last year because of the coal and gas prices. And here you've got the LGC price, and this is when plant has come out and plant has come in on aggregate. So it's a commodity market. So if you build too much, prices go down. And then as you use up that supply, prices go up. It's not really any more complicated than that. So knowing when plant's going to come out or come in is really important for understanding electricity prices. The other key things that drive prices are what it costs to build new generation and then what it costs to operate new and existing generation. So this is both the CapEx and effectively the cost of finance across the last kind of 10 or 15 years. And you can see that, recently we've started seeing that go up. There's a couple of key reasons for that. Supply chain constraints all around the world. So it's really hard to get good pricing for wind turbines because everybody else in the world wants a wind turbine. But there are ways of managing that longer term. But the other key thing that I'd say is that as we enter into a higher interest rate environment, the levelised cost goes up because it's capital intensive infrastructure. And that's something just to be aware of, that it is true that the cost of renewables has gone down materially. It's true that renewables are by far the cheapest source of energy, but it's also true that they're rising in price. And that's literally because of these two factors. But I want to kind of now come to what has driven prices so rapidly up in the last kind of 24 months. This chart shows the coal price landed on the eastern seaboard here since 2009. And you can see that the price for coal was pretty much stable until you get through to rumours of the invasion of Ukraine, and then you see the actual invasion of Ukraine play out there. So prices at their peak on the east coast here, we are talking 6 times higher than the historical average. And the price of electricity in these periods here is almost double the highest ever observable quarter.
Didn't you share the slides?
Yeah,
I'll share all the slides.
Yeah. So this chart shows why moving to renewables is such a smart idea. The more you rely upon a commodity that's traded internationally, the more you tie yourself to these electricity price outcomes. So what's the smartest thing you could do? Get off coal as quickly as possible. Like that's
With that price point, how much do you floods in South Wales also?
So there's 2 questions about last year. One is the very pertinent one you're asking about, which is availability. So a lot of coal plant couldn't get coal into their power stations, but the key thing there is what happened in the gas market. And so this is a really kind of good segue. We didn't plan that, but anyway. So gas markets, if you ever wanted to read about a worse set of investment decisions, I'd like to find them. Building 6 LNG trains. So this is the capacity of these LNG trains since 2015. And this is the gas that's going into those. And you can see that there wasn't ever enough gas to meet the capacity of these trains. Why is there no gas on the East Coast? Well, because it's all being exported and there was never enough to begin with to supply those LNG trains.
Is that because of the Arrow project from the world?
There's a whole bunch of different dynamics, but I kind of just say in conclusion, all 3 participants that built those trains may have thought they had enough gas, but they simply didn't. And so what we're now seeing is this is, if you include domestic load, so this is all of the gas that people use in their homes and businesses, and then this is what goes into LNG. The yellow and the grey is the power generation. That's the daily production capability out of the southern markets, the central market of Queensland. And you can see that the big problem is anyone who's using gas in the south is increasingly reliant upon it coming down from Queensland. There are pipeline constraints because of that. So we see gas prices go through the roof, not just because of the Ukrainian war, but we're also seeing gas prices go up because it's fundamentally a scarce resource here on the East Coast. And this is why gas prices are such a critical thing to understand. It is absolutely true that coal generators set the price most of the time, but the way that they put in their bid structures, they shadow price gas most of the time. And so you'll see that today. All of the coal generators aren't operating flat out. Tallawarra in New South Wales is the power station that's operating. It runs on gas. And so that's the entity that's setting that marginal clearing price in the market. And so if there's nothing else you can take away from what drives electricity prices, it's just this one chart. Electricity and gas prices are really strongly correlated. And there was all of this discussion about a year ago, oh no, they're not going to be correlated anymore. Whilst ever you've got coal generators left in the market, you're going to find that gas prices set the price because people strategically their market, bid their plants in that way. And you can see that gas prices, this is showing the electricity price over the last kind of since 2019. This is all of the Ukrainian situation. And then here is when the government announced a $12 cap and $125 cap. I'm torn personally about whether that's a good idea. Let me tell you why. So I'm torn because the easiest way to convince people to get off gas and coal is to let the price go through the roof. That's the economist in me talking. The person who recognises that that's not a great social outcome says that's probably not the way to go. So I get why it's been done, but I think it's really important we don't let those capped prices drive increased consumption of coal and gas. So that's, I guess, kind of what drives electricity prices. Let's look at supply and demand in each of the states. So this is New South Wales. So this is just a simple low duration chart. So it's all of the observations of demand in 2022, ranked from highest to lowest. And then the green line is if you take out the variable renewables that were supplying energy at that point in time, the demand comes down. So what it's trying to do is show how much demand is there for technologies like storage, for technologies like existing thermal plants. So think of that as gas and coal plants. New South Wales doesn't have a lot of solar and wind at the moment, only a couple of gigawatts. And I say only a couple of gigawatts because compared to South Australia, for instance, it doesn't have much. So this is the result of some simple optimal plant mix analysis. And this is really simple stuff. It's an Excel spreadsheet, so it's not the very complicated work AEMO does. This is today. And so you can see the market's got plenty of capacity, plenty of energy in New South Wales today. But the bottom one is what happens if you pull out Eraring and Liddell and you don't really build much beyond what's already committed. And so one of the things that I think the new government here in New South Wales will be very acutely aware of is that this number here means that you need to build stuff really quickly. Batteries. You need to build batteries. You need to build more pumped hydro. You need to build those clean technologies, whether it's hydrogen, ammonia, whatever it might be. This, I think, is a real issue in New South Wales, that the old plant is coming out. We've known this old plant's going to be coming out for a decade now, 100%. And so, the capacity underwriting mechanism that the Commonwealth's doing, I think, is, long overdue. How it gets designed, I guess, is an interesting kind of thing we'll talk about, but it's really necessary to drive some of this new investment.
So, Tim, that 1.8 shortfall you've got, how much, you said that's only on committed new projects, so Waratah Battery and South Australia Internet?
So interconnectors are kind of assumed away in this analysis. That's the other thing. But I'll come back to why I think that's an important assumption when we talk about South Australia. It includes Kurri Kurri and it includes Tallawarra, because AEMO still include them as projects that are happening. They don't have Waratah yet as a project happening. I know that's weird because we all know it is going to happen. If you include that, probably, yeah. But that number goes down to about 1,100.
But it's still a deficit.
It's still a deficit.
And a significant enough deficit.
Yeah, 100%. Now, I do assume a 15% reserve margin. So if you're a gambler and you're quite happy having to gamble New South Wales politicians staying on, then you probably could run that risk.
Well, within the brands.
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably into that.
Yeah. So I know everybody in the system of government is aware of this, and that's why they're doing this. South Australia is the coolest market in the world, highest proportion of VRE. So you can see at this point here, there is so much renewables in the system. So what's this, about 20% of the year demand negative. So if that interconnector doesn't exist, taking all that power into Victoria and, Tim's point, taking it to New South Wales with Energy Connect, South Australia will be in a world of trouble with having too much renewables. I know that sounds weird. But one of the things that South Australia has shown us is that ramping requirements start to become really important. So ramping, this is basically just the megawatt change in a 30-unit interval between, as it kind of goes up or goes down. The orange line there shows 2010 and the blue line shows 2022. Now remember, 2022 is a La Nina year. So if you picked, maybe next summer being an El Nino year, the solar drops off, the temperature's going up, that ramp could be even higher. Now, you look at 400 megs in a 30-minute increment. Coal can't do that. No way. And that's why the coal-fired power stations are closing down, because they're just the wrong technology. They're old, clunky, breaking down. They're the wrong technology for our market. Batteries can do it. Batteries respond, kind of instantaneously. Some gas plant can do that, but, a lot of gas plants can't. So Torrens Island, for instance, can't. And that's why AGL is closing it. So the thing that I point to in South Australia is that in 2026, you remove Torrens and look again like you're gambling without some more investment. Now, to Tim's point, Energy Connect and other things might make a difference. But if New South Wales and South Australia are both short, you start getting into that territory of how much do you want to gamble it away. So anyway, I find South Australia to be such a cool market because it's really like the guys in South Australia often say to me, oh, you want to talk about NEM 2025, you mean South Australia 2015. Because, they're so much more advanced than everybody else. Victoria is really interesting because it's heading down the same pathway as South Australia. 4 gigs of wind, 1 gig of large-scale solar, and so you can see the gap between the blue and the green is getting bigger. But the problem with Victoria, and I say it's a problem, we don't know when your lawn really is coming out because no one knows what the deal between the government and Energy Australia looks like. So if you remove your lawn, you're actually not that badly off. Like, with a little bit more investment, Victoria doesn't look too bad. The other big issue in Victoria, though, lots of social licence issues, so developing new onshore generation is really challenging. That's why the pivot is to offshore, and I know there's lots of people who've been talking about offshore who are far more expert at those social licence issues than I am. Queensland is the market where everybody's talking about the Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan, and it's a great step forward for decarbonisation. But the reality is there's not much happening between now and 2025. Most of the Queensland activity is actually post-25. It's Barumba, it's the other pump hydro, which I can't remember its name off the top of my head, and most of the investment in renewables I expect would happen after things like copper string and other transmission augmentation. MacArthur?
It's over
In place now.
Oh, being built right now.
McIntyre. Yeah. There's not a hell of a lot, though, happening in Queensland at the moment. But, to be fair, they're setting up the system a bit like the New South Wales roadmap to drive a lot of that change. Some observations about pricing. So this is, again, a really cool observation. And this is why I'll come to kind of talking about this with the CFDs. You can see the prices, the difference between the mean, median, 90th percentile and 10th percentile used to be really narrow. So prices were pretty stable. And then gradually, as you get more renewables, it just splits apart. And that's because when all of the renewables are producing, prices go really low. When renewables disappear, prices go super high. So the other key thing is that everybody used to talk about Q1 summer being the peaking time. It's now, without a doubt, Q2. So winter is when you would expect to see peak pricing manifest the most. And that's largely because you're going to see a lot more electrification. So a lot of people who are using gas for heating are going to switch over to electricity. And that point around coal coming out in ancillary services, this shows just the market value by the different services and then the market in 2021. And you can see that that's where all the value comes for batteries. So when people are banking a battery business case, it's not energy arbitrage, it's FCAS revenue. And that's a really, I guess, important thing to think about. Networks and retail prices. I know I'm flying through this because I know I've got to get through it. Electricity in New South Wales. So this is all the way back to 1955, and you can see that prices came down. This is kind of when they went up because of the, depending upon your perspective, gold plating of the network. They've come back down and they're on their way rapidly up again, and that's largely because of the wholesale component. And if you think about what the structure of a retail bill looks like, half networks, basically half wholesale retail. What I've done though is shown this is the price that was in each of the jurisdictions last year. That's the draft DMO. So you can see that prices are going up a lot compared to what they were. I'll flip through some of these. Network pricing trends. Whenever you hear people talking about, oh, you know, we can't afford to spend lots of money on transmission, this is the chart to show them. So the cumulative regulated asset base of all of the networks in the market is about $100 billion. So if you spend $1 billion on transmission, you increase it by 1%. And remember, that's half of the retail bill. So it would have a 0.5% impact on retail bills. The reason that's so important is if we go back here, you don't need to be a quant genius to know that that's going up by a lot more than 0.5%. So Oliver Nunn, who runs Endgame Economics, sums this up really well when he says, the thing about transmission is that it absolutely reduces wholesale prices. And so you can't just look at transmission in isolation. You have to think about what it does to the rest of the market.
To your point, that 1 billion, though, the depreciation rate on 105 billion of regulated assets would have to invest 5 billion to stay in business.
100%.
So all this crap about worrying about 20 billion over a decade, that's underinvesting.
Yeah. My personal view, you couldn't build transmission quicker. Like, that's just a personal view. But here's where I think there's also some great opportunity. So if we could have our time again in the last 20 years, we wouldn't have all put in an air conditioner and then put in a solar system and then worked out, oh, geez, all of the network costs are going up because I've added to the peak demand issue and then I've carved out all of this demand by putting in solar PV. And so you can see that this is average household consumption, and you can see that it's largely steady in each state. And then it gets to 2010, we all put in a solar system and LED lights, and we see it all decline away. And why is this so important? Because networks are basically fixed capacity assets, so dollars per megawatt. And if you have fewer megawatt hours going through them, then the unit price in dollars per megawatt hour goes up. And so if we're not using these networks efficiently, then of course we're all paying more in dollars per megawatt hour. And this shows what would happen if you electrified everybody's home. And there's a whole bunch of simplistic assumptions in here. But if we all go and get an EV and we all go and put in a heat pump and we all go and kind of get rid of the gas heater, great outcome for the climate, but it does mean that there is both huge risk and huge opportunity. Huge risk in the sense that if we just let everybody use electricity whenever they feel like, it's going to massively add to the peak demand issues. But if we do some smart things, we can actually lower the unit costs for everyone. And I want to give you a really good example. This doesn't require any new technology. This is sitting here waiting for some smart person to go away and do it. This is in Ausgrid's hatch. So here in Sydney in the Central Coast, so you can see Sydney local government areas in the Central Coast. If you look at all of the off-peak hot water and then you compare it with solar exports, it is just this massively, huge opportunity. This is asking to be consumed by hot water. So if we rip out all of those off-peak electric systems and put in heat pumps, far more efficient, and they use energy in the middle of the day, then all of those solar export problems that we see creating big issues for the network disappear. You get more use through the network in the middle of the day. It improves the outcome for everyone. It's such an easy thing to do, but for whatever reason, people are so attracted to EVs and all the other sexy things. We get hot water right, we buy ourselves a bit of time. Like, this is really important.
Why has that not been done? It's been obvious for 5 years. So do we just need Tim Jordan to have a rule change?
My personal view is that there's two things you could do. One is you could incentivise the distribution businesses to actually do it. So you could say to them, here's a bucket of money, go and do it.
Push that button in the middle of the
mandate them to do it. There's a whole bunch of different things. The other thing is you could introduce more scheme type arrangements. I know New South Wales has those. The only problem with schemes is that the way they kind of manifest is it takes a long time for people to become aware of them. Mandating this would be so simple to me.
People just still very big to charge them, but the actual need to replace it. Absolutely.
common pricing.
Yeah. Look, cost-effective tariffs are important, but for me, the heat is so much more efficient. So much more efficient. And, you could constrain the amount of hours that the heat pump's actually using the energy to pretty much when the solar's operating. So it's It's almost like this really neat bit that we've forgotten about. But yeah, you're right. You know, plan B, just make them run in the middle of the day. But maybe not on days like today. Yeah.
Coal plants would be.
Exactly. Well, yeah, we need to build stuff. That's the now contract design. I've got about 2 or 3 minutes, so I'm going to rapidly go through this. But this is something which I'm hoping will make you kind of think, oh, geez, maybe this is not as simple as we've heard. So spot prices are influenced by contracts. If you look to kind of like the standard way in which the IEA kind of thinks about things, you've got long-term, medium-term, and short-term. And that's where you get, capacity markets, so things like, kind of a capacity market. Medium term, you've got forward markets, so think of derivatives, swaps, and caps. And in the short term, you've got day ahead, intraday balancing, so real time. And the NEM is effectively a balancing real time market. But the key things here are spot prices are intrinsically linked to the positions in forward markets. So if I'm an entity that's sold a bucket load in the forward market, my incentives to generate or not generate are very different from somebody who's just running merchant. Let's think about South Australia at the moment. There are 4 distinct supply curves. Now, I've got a whole bunch of maths that I like showing off with, but it's not really that complicated. This is actually what it looks like. The run-of-plant PPA with no $0 price floor. This was the arrangement that was put in place by the pioneers through the ACT CFD. And a lot of people kind of stick the boot in and say, how did you get that wrong? But they were, the first doing it, so you can't give them too much of a hard time. But what this means is that if I'm a seller of renewables and I've got this contract in place, I just bid my plant in at negative 1,000, keep it there every day. Not a great outcome for the market. So a lot of people then came along and said, look, let's mitigate this risk. Let's include a $0 price floor. And what that means is that if I'm a seller, I'll bid it in at the negative LGC value. So I want to capture that LGC value. Then you've got what I would call a firmed renewables portfolio. So this is Snowy. This is Iberdrola Australia. And then you've got the merchant thermal plant. So this is basically the plant left in South Australia. So think of like Snapper Point that's owned by Nexa. Now I want you to think about what the dynamics look like in the South Australian market. So this is last year, September through December. The different bid stacks are all shown in these colours. So you can see you've got, these are the generators that are directed on. So think of them as, the AGL units that are basically there for system strength. This dark blue is where people are offering a bid at negative 1,000 to negative 500. And then you can see there's a little bit, further up. What the lines are demand at the P10, the P90, the average, and median. See the P10, you're seeing now hit deep in the negative 1,000 to negative 500. Why is this such an important observation for CFDs? So if we go back to this, they're happy. The buyers aren't happy, but they're happy. They're starting to get really unhappy in this world because this portfolio, up until here, bids in at negative 1,000 because they make more money because their customer load is being paid the $1,000, and as long as they're short to that, they maximise profit. So what does it effectively mean? It means this business model steals output market share from this business model. Now, why is that so important? Well, what's the purpose of a run-of-plant PPA? It's to mitigate risk. Now, if all I've done is locked in a price, but then actually exposed myself to significant output risk, then my project finance bankers are not going to be happy with me. What's more, though, if my incentives are to get more generation into the market, maybe the run-of-plant PPA CFD is not the model that makes sense over 20 years. It might be making sense for 2 years, but there are these fundamental contract design questions that, I don't think people who are buying and selling these things for 20 years really know what they're doing because they can't manage the output variability risk. And so this is a summary of everything that I've just said, so I won't go through that. And that's it. Ooh.
You got that. No, thank you very much. We might park questions, if that's all right, until the end, if that works for everybody, just to keep others on board. But you see why Tim is very much loved in the energy sector, because There is no way I could do that without someone like Tim helping us through it. Our next speaker is going to be Professor Tina, amongst many other talents, is alumni, so
Law,
well, we'll still change, you know,
for science and political science, not for law.
and Tina is an expert in all things wet. Well, yeah, wet is a nice description. So oil and gas, but also offshore renewables. So I'll hand over to Tina.
So what I've been asked to present on is what's the similarity and differences in the legal regimes in the offshore sector. So offshore energy. So basically looking at offshore petroleum and then also looking at offshore renewables. Now, when we say offshore renewables, what we really mean is wind. But I will touch very slightly on co-location, which the Blue Economy CRC sees as very, very exciting, which is putting hydrogen and wind together, which is, for want of a better word, a bit of a regulatory nightmare because, and you're probably going to hear those words, and you're going to hear a lot of NOPSEMA, which is the National Offshore Petroleum Safety and Environmental Management Authority, who regulates offshore wind. And then there's not to the titles office. So what I thought I'd do, I'm going to have a look at a few things. First of all, I want to have a look at the approach and the scope of the study. Sort of this is a study in progress and sort of embedded in legal theory. Then looking at the life cycle of petroleum and renewables. Then I'm going to go through each of the phases of the life cycle. And then I'm just going to orally draw some conclusions rather than actually put a big list up. So first of all, this is confined to the offshore zone. So what that means is you've got the territorial sea, which retains a nation's sovereignty from the baseline, which is the low water mark that is designated low water mark on a nation's accepted charts or maps, which can be different. It can be mean baseline, it can be absolute baseline, it can be low water mark, it can be anything. And then it goes all the way to 12 nautical miles. We've also got the sovereign rights that are conferred under Article 60 of UNCLOS. So Article 2 of UNCLOS confers the territorial sea rights, and Article 60 confers, 56 confers the UNCLOS's sovereign rights. Now, what does sovereign rights mean? Sovereign rights is quite different to sovereignty. It means that a nation state, so when I talk about a state, I'm not talking about the individual states here, I'm talking about Australia, the nation state, has the right to explore for and exploit living and non-living resources in the water column and the seabed. Okay? And then there's a whole range of things around movements of ships and innocent passage and all that. But the most important thing is they've got the right to explore. They don't own the resources. That's really important. They don't own the water. They don't own the petroleum. They have the right to grant a license for the petroleum, for exploration or exploitation. So Australia made a legislative application of a completely different application of the law. So in 1973, the Australian government quite rightly, says me, but also the High Court said it, so it must be okay, applied what was UNCLOS 1, so before this UNCLOS came out or was ratified. It had been agreed in 1982 but not ratified till 94. So before this came out under the old law of the sea, so the 1958 agreement on whatever it is, that the territorial sea region belonged to the Commonwealth. Now that's very different to the cannon shot rule, which was the old colonial that was inherited from the British, which is 3 nautical miles. So they made a law called the Sea and Submerged Lands Act in 1973. New South Wales, because New South Wales challenges everything, challenged it. And the High Court said, no, you're wrong, which is really interesting because there's been a case of Lamakia about 3 or 4 years earlier about fisheries that had reinforced the 3 nautical miles, but clearly not for the purposes of a state's jurisdiction in terms of fisheries. So then we had the Sea and Submerged Lands challenge, Sea and Submerged Lands case in 1975 at the High Court. High Court, as I said no, definitely the states, the Commonwealths. All the states got hysterical really hysterical. They all agreed on something called the Offshore Constitutional Settlement. It was agreed in 1979, put into legislation in 1980. And that's what creates this difficulty that Natalie was talking about earlier, about that there's an area, and it's 3 nautical miles, that the Commonwealth doesn't control. It's controlled by the state. And so the idea was to have mirror legislation and everything's going to be okay, right up until they put the greenhouse gas stuff into the Offshore Petroleum Act and made it the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Act. And the Commonwealth took over, controlling all of that, but Western Australia didn't update their laws, although Victoria did. North Shore Sea is much easier. They have a territorial sea and the EEZ, and they have none of this 3 nautical mile. It's just all effectively federal. So how am I doing it? I'm doing it with a functional methodology. So I'm comparing functions. And that's because Zweig and Kotz is the legal authority on this. Fundamental tool in comparative analysis is functional analysis because you can't compare incomparables. So I'm comparing at the decommissioning phase or the operational phase or at the licensing for exploration phase. So you can only compare the comparables. That way you can compare any country in the world. You don't have to worry about civil or common law jurisdiction or Islamic law. You don't have to worry about any of that. So what's the life cycle? This is what the life cycle looks like. The question is, which one's which? Well, actually, there's a very slight difference in life cycle, but not enough to even notice. You've got basically exploration and appraisal, although you've got appraisal and exploration in the bottom one, which is wind. Then you have development, production, you have decommissioning and removal. So you basically look for somewhere to do your activity. You do some investigation. You then work out whether you're going to make a final investment decision. If you're going to, you then develop it. You then developing with building everything, so not quite with means. Then you go in and you produce whatever it is you're going to produce it for how long you're going to produce it, and then you take it all offline and you decommission and removal. I'm not going to get into that so much because that's just, as Natalie was saying this morning, that's just a whole new area of law. I'm doing a lot of work with the regulator, not SEMA, in training them on what the legal framework is about this, which is really quite frightening because they're the ones making the decision, the legal decisions, and they've already made legal decisions, by the way, with regard to this. Excuse me. So, without further ado, this is how you allocate a petroleum licence. And I say petroleum licence because the wind licence are quite different. You either do it by money or by criteria. So your money can either be, I bid cash, bidding, not surprisingly, or I bid, I'm going to do work. I'm going to do 600 kilometres of seismic survey and I'm going to do 31 wells. You then have something called a discretionary method, which is there's 2 types of methods there. The old discretionary discretion, which is, Norway says, I'm just going to give it to all the Norwegian companies because we want to build up our industry. Since 1994, you can't do that, mainly because of the hydrocarbon directive in the EU and also because of the Energy Charter Treaty, which, again, give you a whole sort of day on it. And then we've got what we call objective discretion. You have a set of criteria, and against that criteria, you award a licence. Is there still some discretion in that? Absolutely. And it's about what do you want to get out of it. So what I'm going to do now is have these tables looking at a comparison of each of them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw out. So the first thing you'll notice with an oil and gas lease, you always need an exploration licence to explore. The only country that doesn't have an exploration licence is Norway, which has a production licence to explore. Don't ask why. They used to have an exploration licence which you couldn't explore for. So an exploration licence in Norway, I think it's called it's basically a look and see licence. That's prospecting, which is basically like you go to a doctor and you've got a broken arm and they go, we'll take an x-ray, but we're not going to do anything invasive. That's what prospecting is. Oh, and by the way, you can't have the area to yourself. A exploration license or a production license in Norway will grant you exclusive possession. And so there's a whole range of property rights that go with this, which, again, is another story. You have to, in Australia, get it generally by work program bidding. So you bid, and whoever's the highest bidder gets it. If there's two or more equally deserving parties or applicants, then they just rate them and look, and it's actually a decision about, who's going to look most favourably at me at the next conference, essentially. And there are some provisions for that. It's pretty much a load of crock. There are some problems with this system. One of the problems is that the big companies will hold the government over a barrel. We had an issue in early 2000 in the Cornea field. Again, it's been written up. That's very different to wind. In wind, you don't explore or look at the feasibility. What you do first is you build it. It's called a research and demonstration license. You build a turbine, a bit like you were talking about the Siemens, test turbine. So you build a test turbine and then you see if it works. So you're allowed to build, and then when you, so you're allowed to build a research and demonstration license, and then that's just given to whoever's got technical capability. Extremely discretionary. So that would fall under the discretionary discretion. And this is what it says. This is taken from the Act. So it's got to be likely to be viable. The eligible person is suitable, and any other criteria they see fit, which haven't really been set yet. Then once you, with your wind, think that you might have found a good spot, then you actually have a look. So whereas with petroleum, it authorises you to explore for petroleum. You can recover petroleum so much as you need in order to assess it. With wind, the purpose is really to make sure that the technology is going to work offshore. So you can construct, install, commission, operate, maintain and decommission, but only for those things that are set out up the top here in section 49, to conduct research and to demonstrate capabilities. Once you've demonstrated that, then in wind you would go to something called a feasibility licence, which is essentially in the appraisal section. So oil and gas, what happens with oil and gas is you find oil. You've struck oil. You then need to appraise it. So you're going to go off and you're going to have a look at all your seismic survey, you're going to look at your well cores, you're going to have to do a few more around the basin to see how far the extent is. So you'll model your basin, you'll interpret the cores, and then you do your petroleum assaying, which is basically what sort of crude is it? Is it sweet light, sweet sour, sweet light, sweet heavy, sour light, sour heavy? And of course, Australia is sour heavy, although not as bad as Kazakhstan. We have crappy oil, by the way, really crappy oil. Best oil in the world is Brent blend in the North Sea. But we have really, really south, which means it's got a lot of sulphur in it. When you find oil, you then declare a discovery. Oh my God, I found oil under section 129 to 131 of the Act, the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Act. You then apply for one of two things: production licence to go and produce petroleum, or you apply for something called a retention licence. Australia is the only country in the world that has petroleum retention licences. So we were talking before about the PL offshore of New South Wales, PL1, offshore of Newcastle. There is a petroleum licence. It was actually granted in 2000, 2001. It's been 20 years. They haven't even done their primary work program. Remember I said you need to do a primary and secondary work program to get your licence? They haven't even done that yet, because they've been able to put it on retention lease and just sort of book it. And the idea is that it's not yet commercial, but it will be. Not commercially viable. What does that mean? We don't know. Whereas here, once you've done your R&D and you go, I think we might be a bit of a goer, but we're not, it's demonstrated it might be, but let's see how it's going to go big scale. You then do your feasibility study. So here it's an access license again. Access meaning getting you into the area. It's different to something else, which I'll go through in a minute. So your access license is an objective discretionary now. This is your feasibility license. So it's the technical and financial capability, the likely viability of the project, the suitability of the applicant, and then the national interest. Now, this is a really interesting thing. The word national interest has not appeared in any offshore document since probably the 1970s, maybe the 80s. I actually did my PhD on this. So this is really interesting. The question is, what is the national interest? Now, there is some stuff that's going to be coming out. One of my PhD students looked at it in terms of the context of Oman and their production sharing contracts. We don't know what the Australian national interest is. We presume that national interest is maintaining our Kyoto Protocol and our targets, but it doesn't say that. The Act actually says the purpose is the national interest. So then we go to production. Production is very similar. We need two types of licenses now. We need to access the field in order to get on the ground, get that access, because you remember the state's got the sovereign right and can grant you that permission. So petroleum will use production, wind will use a commercial license. Both of it is to exploit the resources, and that right is granted under Article 60 of UNCLOS. We also need operational licenses. So in petroleum, you will need an operational license. There's two types. You'll need a pipeline license for your pipelines, which we talked about this morning. And then you'll also need something called an infrastructure license. That's to build your platforms and all of that. Platforms, helicopters, or put in your FPS and your floating production vessel. So that infrastructure license enables the construction of platforms. You'll notice there is no infrastructure license required under the commercial license. That's because the commercial license, just the grant of a commercial license, gives you the right to construct. And in fact, under all of the licenses, the research and demonstration license and the feasibility license, both of them allow you to construct. So it's inherent within the license. Whereas petroleum, you can only bring in one of those jackups or a temporary rig. You do, however, need a transmission and infrastructure license to undertake the storing, transmitting or conveying of electricity or renewable energy product in or through the licensed area. So what it doesn't cover, if you look at this is the wording from the Act, it says undertake the storing, transmitting or conveying of electricity or renewable energy product in or through the licensed area. But there is some question about, well, what if there is a multi-purpose, what sort of infrastructure, what about the transmission issues there? Because it doesn't really talk about anything else other than electricity. So say we get hydrogen, the whole Act will have to be rewritten. It only talks about electricity. So this Act is only for electricity, the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act. And so there's a merit criteria for this grant again. So it's a discretionary. Let's talk about safety. Time? Yep. Safety. Okay. So what can I say? We use something in petroleum called the safety case. Well tested, well used. We had an accident in 1988 called Piper Alpha. 167 men died. It was absolutely shocking. I lived in Aberdeen for 7 years, and for 7 years, every one of us went to the memorial and we spent the time remembering this, which is what drives most of us to work in safety. It uses a concept called ALAR. You reduce the risk of an accident or an incident to as low as reasonably practical. What is that, you might ask? We have two definitions. One comes from the UK Health and Safety Executive, which says it's provision and maintenance of plants and systems of work. So it's not just a physical thing, it's how you work. So far as reasonably practicable, safe, and without risks to health. So that includes things like how you design a plant. So you don't put the dial or the meter for gas in a pipeline at 7.5 feet above the deck so that nobody can read it, which is what basically was the root cause of Piper Alpha. Going, yeah, I think it's working. It wasn't. And the damn thing blew. And the definition is actually in community law, and it was in the National Coal Board, which says the risk must be significant in relation to the sacrifice. And it's about gross proportionality. And then we come to wind. Now, Penny is nodding her head. Penny and I both put in extensive submissions, and I've written papers on this, and I've done numerous submissions on this to the Commonwealth, and apparently to no avail, because this is what we have. So it takes, so that should be 226. The Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act says, we're going to take the Workplace Health and Safety Act 2011 of the Commonwealth. We're going to apply that. But by the way, doesn't all apply. So it applies to things, work in the nature of offshore infrastructure, any other work carried out under the licence or any other work carried out under the Act. But there's a carve-out at section 231 that says, but not for certain vessels, structures and facilities that are under section 12A of that Act, the Workplace Health and Safety Act, then the strict liability doesn't apply. Then we're going to apply in the wet bits, we're going to apply the Maritime Safety Act. So the Workplace Health and Safety Act only applies to the turbines. And then we're going to replace section 274 of the Workplace Health and Safety Act, Commonwealth, with our own section 274 that's in the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act. We're going to put that in because that Act with the Workplace Health and Safety Act was never really fit for purpose. And then we're going to apply some of the provisions of the Workplace Health and Safety Act, but not others. But God help you if you are transferring from a vessel, and this is what you do. I've done it in Aberdeen Bay. Anyone ever seen pilots do it? Not pilots as in planes, because they don't jump out of it, but pilots from a boat, a little boat in a harbour, will jump from the little boat onto a great big ship and bring it into port. That's their job. So they're all covered under the Maritime Safety Act in Australia because they're jumping from one ship to another ship. So they're covered. But if you, in this instance, if you jump from a ship to a platform and you fall down, you're not covered by any law. And do you want to know something? The unions love this. I've got a meeting with the MUA, Maritime Union of Australia, tomorrow. We can have a little chat, which is going to basically start with, you're an idiot because you think this is better than that. And you think this is going to keep your guys safer. So this is, Penny's nodding and nodding and nodding. This is a major, major problem, and this is going to kill people. Somebody said that people die on wind.
That was me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's 4 times the level because people are just on wind. Yeah, than oil and gas. Because everybody thinks oil and gas because of the volatile substances. By the way, are very well controlled. Wind breeds complacency. I did a paper with a colleague from Aberdeen. We looked at the UK and Australia. And the wind deaths in the UK are phenomenal. And I mean, not phenomenally good, but phenomenally shocking. And the incidence of injury. And there's a real need for this. So what about the environment? We've got a really good environment system for offshore. We've got environmental regs that basically say you've got to write an environment plan. You've got to make sure that you've done everything. And when you do, it's very similar to a safety case and reduce the risk to as low as reasonably practical. And when you do, we will give you permission to undertake your activity. In wind, we do something called a management plan, which is defined as a plan for the offshore infrastructure activities and other activities that have been carried out under the licence that has been approved by the regulator. Do we know what the criteria is for approving it? We're thinking about it. Do we have any separate environment requirements? No, that's not even we're thinking about it. Section 114 requires the licence holder to prepare a plan, and that plan is called a management plan. There is no details, there is no information, there is no nothing about what you need to put in it. We're thinking about it. Talking of thinking, my last slide, which is decommissioning, we have very good requirements for decommissioning in offshore, although as Natalie pointed out today, what we're working on is there's some very big gaps. It says use it or remove it. It doesn't say use it, then think about what else you can use it for. And then if you can't use it for anything else, remove it. It's just use it or remove it. And also, it's interesting because there's guidelines, which, by the way, are not legally binding because they're not referred to or legalised in the Act. It says, oh, remove it, but if you can do something that is environmentally just as good, then you can leave it there. It's okay. So I've already sort of been toe to toe with Woodside about removing their FPSO from the riser turret mooring, which is part of a floating offshore petroleum production vessel, about leaving something. They actually wanted to take it, move it somewhere, and then scuttle it, which then became sea dumping. That's the reason why we all laugh at sea dumping. So it's very, very clear that we have a long way to go with offshore electricity. Some other issues, well, Denmark, they use onshore laws, and they say they're probably not good enough as they get out into the deep. And there's a recognition, exactly what Penny said, there's this dawning recognition that, oh shit, people can die. And people do die. And so there is calls for a new offshore wind law. Norway, which is obviously the one I'm most comfortable with. Health, safety and environment, petroleum is regulated under the Petroleum Safety Authority. And they have said very clearly this, regulations for renewable energy production at sea must be tailored to the activity, particularly in relation to risk, and we must take inspiration from other similar industries, such as wind power on land, offshore wind in other countries, and not least, the petroleum sector. So what will their laws for offshore safety look like? I can tell you now they're going to look exactly like the petroleum safety laws. Now, the United Kingdom, we wrote a paper on this, for mitigating occupational health and safety risks in what was proposed offshore. Eddie Weaver and I wrote it, and we said you must use the safety case. This was originally a submission to government in 2019, 2020, early 2020. Then we did another submission when the regs did come out, the Act did come out. We published this. Penny did an extraordinary submission. It was 10 times better than mine, but because it wasn't as rushed. And it really detailed very well because we looked at a whole range of issues, but Penny's was fabulous. If you want to read a submission, you should read Penny's, which said basically you're a bunch of morons because you're thinking of doing this when you know it doesn't work, and the safety case works really well, and people died. And they went, yeah, no, we're going to ignore Penny. If they want to ignore me, that's fine. You know, I'm a thorn in their side. But, you know, what Penny had to say was extraordinarily pointed, and it just wasn't listened to. And on that note, I'm going to end.
You were beautifully in time, and I really appreciate that.
Well, it's true. I mean, I've got a copy for the union tomorrow. It says, don't listen to me, listen to Penny.
We'll take this one offline at lunchtime.
Yeah.
This is one of the challenges, I think, when you work in the energy sector, is that there is, I think, a general perception that actually renewables will always be better at everything. And renewables, obviously, complete game changer, great at many things. But we also do have a lot that we can learn from other sectors, such as oil and gas, such as mining. And I think we're foolish not to.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a tendency to think, oh, well, actually, that's the old way of doing things. But actually, the old way of doing things has had a lot of experience.
And of course, the problem is that our safety regulator, I mean, look, CIMA can barely do the safety case regime. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, CIMA has recognised its own limitations and you would agree, I think, Penny, they've clearly recognised their own limitations in applying the safety case regime for a whole range of reasons. So if they can't get their head around something that's actually really easy, like it's not hard, the safety case regime, how the hell are they going to do this? I mean, you know, it took me 5 hours to work it out last night because they've added some new stuff. They've done the reforms for the Workplace Health and Safety Act.
Yes,
Question. Thanks for the presentation.
I think we're holding questions until the end, aren't we?
well, I will take my question and we'll go to.
So my question is really, you're also doing research very different states, or you're focusing only on oil and gas industry and hopefully it's like.
So I'm focusing on the generation, the making of energy, whatever that energy is. So this is just about making electricity.
Yes, are you also looking at the different frameworks applicable in different states of offshore wind industry, like Victoria, New South Wales?
They are going to do an MOU with all of the different states for that 3 nautical miles. My understanding is it still hasn't been done yet. New South Wales is holding out because New South Wales always does. Whereas Victoria is kind of like, just have it because they're sick of regulating. You've got to understand there's a big friction between, so this is going to be a problem in Western Australia, I can guarantee it. There's a problem and a friction between the Commonwealth and the state over offshore petroleum. And it's just a real thorn in their side. So there's supposed to be an MOU for those first 3 nautical miles, but I think New South Wales is going to be problematic. They're probably going to be pulled into COAG and said, you don't get your funding for the state if you don't sign the MOU. What's COAG called now? Ministerial Council. Yeah. So they'll be called into the Ministerial Council and they'll be threatened, I suspect. It's been done before. They did it to Western Australia.
As you can see, there are many issues that are live in the energy sector today. And with that, please join me in thanking Tina. Now, our next speaker is Rob Grant, and Rob has the distinguished title of being both an engineer and has a background in finance. But the reason why I asked Pollination to come and speak, Pollination are one of the most innovative companies that are currently working in the sector in Australia today. And I thought it'd be really interesting to learn about what is really happening at the cutting edge. So that's why we invited you. So take it away, and I'll leave you to explain Pollination and how it all works. And yeah. Here you go.
Nice introduction. Yeah, so Rob Grant is my name. I am the Managing Director and Head of Projects for Pollination. My background is in renewable energy for the last 25 something years. And like Tim, started my career in the electricity sector working for an independent power producer. But really only focusing on renewables back at a time when we were trying, actually there wasn't any MRED, there wasn't any sort of demand pull mechanism. We were trying to make the sort of the only renewable energy at the time, which was hydropower, economically viable in jurisdictions where we were competing against imported fossil fuels. So we ended up getting the benefit of some early PPAs from SSCV when they were being privatised back in the mid-90s, and then built on that to go and build a large-scale hydro project medium-sized hydro project up in the East Kimberley, which is taking back to this bookend of my career. And in between then at Pacific Hydro, we built a business and projects and I've got a team over the next 18 years. So long time on the client side, long time on the developer side. Then went across, I was fascinated about, how the contractors always seem to get it wrong, and they had always great ideas about how to get it right. So I went across to a contractor to see how the black box worked, and that was pretty uninspiring. So I came back to the client side. I've done a bit of time in setting up the Energy Investor Group here in Australia to help out with all of that institutional investor difficulties in the market when they sort of flooded in because of renewable energy in places that probably couldn't handle it at any some particular points in time, and lots of problems with NLF and supply and constraint issues, getting access to the grid. And then I had a call at the end of 2019 from Fortescue to go there and be Director of Energy, which was really about bringing their decarbonisation challenge and aspiration to life. So it was decarbonising the iron ore business predominantly, and then in that there was the beginning of how to use and apply hydrogen to that decarbonisation target. And then that became Fortescue Future Industries, and I left them in December of 2021. And Martin Wilder, who had started Pollination, is also the inaugural chair of ARENA and on the board of CSC, and we've had similar careers in pollination. So today I'm going to talk a bit about what, a little bit what pollination is, and then I'm just using a case study of what a project looks like in our group, because the market is extremely different to what it was 25 years ago in terms of the ability to be competitive as a renewable energy developer. And one thing pollination is not going to be is a renewable energy developer. It's more about trying to focus on, because that's really well spoken for in the market currently. There's lots of great developers and developers here, lots of institutional investors are here, lots of low cost of capital are here. But what we're, and that's going to sort of service the decarbonisation of about half of our emissions in Australia. And the other half of the emissions have still got a question mark. They're the hard-to-abate sectors. So we're really trying to focus on pollination, in my group anyway, on the decarbonisation of the hard-to-abate sectors through the application of low-cost renewables. So I'm going to talk a bit about us, the partnership that is the Aboriginal Energy Partnership, and about the project that it relates to. And as for the intro, pollination has been around for a couple of years now. It started this pre-pandemic, and it's really trying to bring this amazing cohort of subject matter experts, and I feel quite overwhelmed being in there because these people are amazing. They have all of these long track records and all these the weird and wonderful parts of the decarbonisation and nature positive journey, and that covers everything from energy policy to climate change policy to carbon credit market expertise to technological expertise, and now building energy capability and funds management capability. And we're trying to create the model for how we can service the part of the economy that is really just now engaging with how to achieve decarbonisation and net zero target. We've been in this industry for 20-something years. We're battle weary from talking about policy and fighting politics to get the response to climate change. So we understand all that, but the vast majority of the economy doesn't really get it, hasn't really affected them because the politics is allowed to sort of put in the sand. So it's a really important role for an organisation like Pollination to be able to help those organisations. And we do that by having three verticals in the business: advisory. So we have sort of a corporate and strategic advisory group that goes and helps corporations basically to measure what their emissions are, set strategy and targets around how to achieve reductions, whether they be voluntary or mandatory, and whether that be in carbon or nature. And then we also, through the second vertical of the project group, help them implement and action those strategies and targets. And then if they need help with the financing of those, or we are also trying to connect all the capitalists in the world that's trying to get these projects through our funds management vertical to stand up a funds management business. So it's sort of the best sort of analogy is a merchant bank. In the early days, that's the model. We originate from the very early stage through what we do with advisory, project opportunities before they come to market. That's sort of quite different to what we've been doing as independent power producers in the energy market. And joining that up with the capital downstream that is desperately looking for homes to place all this allocations that have been given to decarbonisation investment. So, as I said earlier, right at the beginning of my career, I was involved in the commissioning phase of a 30 megawatt hydro project up in the East Kimberley at Kununurra. It's based on Lake Argyle, and it's the second largest inland water resource in the country. It was built to supply energy to both Argyle Diamond Mine, which is subsequently owned now by Rio Tinto, and to the towns of Kununurra and Wyndham. It's a totally isolated grid. And it actually ran as the largest renewable hybrid grid in the country for a long, long time, for 20 years or something, and very successfully. the interactions with the traditional owners at the time we developed that project, the Pacific Hydro developed that project, was transformational in the sense of the transformation of native title and heritage was only just emerging. So the time that we were going to get approval to build these assets, around the time of Mabo, there weren't the prescribed body corpus, there weren't these native title determinations. And so the agreements that were set up with the native title holders up there were quite immature. And certainly we lived with that throughout the life of the asset when I was at Pacific Hydro, and always felt that there was something more that we should be doing up there because a lot of that was quite unjust relative, and the same would go for and to much greater extent to the value integrated out of something like the Argyle Diamond Mine, and the amount of money that ultimately ended up going to traditional owners, given it is on their land. So coming back to pollination and the fact that the Argyle Diamond Mine closed in December 2020 and there's some available capacity from that hydropower, we decided to look at could we stand up for the first time a traditional owner-owned and led development vehicle that would be able to undertake a feasibility and then hopefully go through as far as they could towards through the feed phase and FID to develop a project of large scale that would be feeding into the demand for green hydrogen and green ammonia. So in July of last year, we set up the Aboriginal Energy Partnership, and it's an equal partnership between two traditional owner groups based in Kununurra and Wyndham, on whose land the project is proposed to be built. And it's freehold land up there because some of the land given to MG Corporation, which is the group closest to Kununurra, is compensation for the flooding of flooding of Lake Argyle in the first instance, and that was a compensation piece of property. And then up at Wyndham, which is on the Cambridge Gulf, and where the port will be, is also this land that's determined native title, exclusive native title for Ballangara. We've included in there also the Kimberley Land Council. So the Kimberley Land Council was the first land council set up for the Kimberley to help all of the prescribed body corporates get their native title determinations through. And they're sort of moving into a post-Mabo phase of, well, now we've got all these PBCs set up, what are we going to do to build balance sheet capability, but build commercial capacity and balance sheet wealth in a post-Mabo era. And so, although this is a specific project for the East Kimberley, the involvement of KLC allows us to tell the story and replicate the story more broadly through the Kimberley and throughout Western Australia, and then hopefully throughout Australia, particularly where there is determinated title. So we also strongly believe, and we are all equal partners in that, so we're all 25% shareholders. The two traditional owner groups, two PBCs, bring land, culture, country. Pollination brings the development expertise and connection to capital, and also the KLC provides that capacity building and umbrella and capability development. We are all equal shareholders, and therefore the traditional owners are the majority shareholders. And we believe that the opportunity here is that if the project is economically viable, so I'm talking about hydrogen, but if it's economically viable, then this project will be first to market because we're running an integrated development process that will put heritage and native title, ethnographic surveys, all those things embedded into an integrated development process at the same time as environmental, technical, and other development work. And that's very different to how all resource projects get developed in Western Australia and how most renewable energy projects get developed across the country, which is developer comes along, finds a bit of land, does a bit of assessment, site assessment, resource assessment, does a bit of engineering and environmental review, and then goes to the traditional owners and says, this is what we think, we'd like your approval. And it's a very arm's length stakeholder model, and we're trying to now integrate or transform the model to have the traditional owners as shareholders from the beginning rather than stakeholders partway through the process. And even if the project, for whatever reason, isn't economically viable and cannot proceed, then the skills and the capacities we've built in the TO groups as we're going through this process and having them sitting at a board table of a joint venture SPV is something that they are as equally excited about and learning from failure and from success from this opportunity. So that, I'll leave you to read those yourself, but the Pilbara, the Kimberley traditional owner groups do not have much money. There's not a lot of mining in the Kimberley, therefore the PVCs do not have large royalty incomes. And there is a very significant social deficit problem in the Kimberley, and the mining that has been there has not left much behind our other diamond mines. So basically, we have finished a bit of rehab. Kununurra doesn't really look any different today than it did 20 years ago, and they're pulling out sort of $20 million a week out of their mine for the last 25 or 30 years. So it's not much of a legacy left there. So this opportunity where there is self-determination, economic independence, co-design and co-decision, making opportunities is what the traditional owner groups now want to bed and try out. And we have to do that for a couple of reasons, because if we're going to, particularly in WA, which has so much of the renewable energy resource of Australia, if we are going to reach our decarbonisation targets by 2030 and 50, we are not going to get there if we use the same model that we've used historically, particularly with resources and particularly to less degree with renewables. We have to have the traditional owners assessing which part of their own country they would like to have renewables considered for and bring it to the market. Can't have the market going to the traditional owners all the time saying, we would like permission, and then this sort of back and forward. Quite distributive negotiation model, which has been all the resources sector. I think we'll see an interesting determination soon by the big report on the Fortescue loss about the Barney case of the on reading for the title fight, which is about how the resources sector didn't properly pay the royalties for the Pilbara mining that Fortescue undertook. So with the project at this stage, the project is a large-scale renewable energy project that will utilise the existing available hydropower that I talked about before. And really the hydropower is going to be used to maintain steady output of ammonia production 24/7. So I'll talk a bit about, to jump to the process of making hydrogen. So green hydrogen is really just liquefied electrons. Green ammonia is liquefied electrons, but use the solar energy to create electricity that is then put into the electrolyser, and the electrolyser produces hydrogen. And from that point on, it just looks like any other, then determine what any other industrial demand for hydrogen be, which is currently made from all the hydrogen we make currently is from natural gas. So it's just a different way of making hydrogen. It used to be the way that we made hydrogen. In fact, till the supply of large-scale natural gas from the North Sea, Norway used to make all its from hydropower and electrolysis. That's why electrolyser companies are actually mainly Norwegian heritage. So we're going back to that. But the process of making it into hydrogen creates this the gas, which then is not easily transportable. It's very low volumetric density. So the best way to do something with it is create a product that the market is going to that currently uses, but has to be decarbonised. In this case, that's ammonia. So you've got the nitrogen from the air, combine it with the hydrogen, make ammonia, and that Haber-Bosch process is something that's done all over the world. So it's then used as ammonia, then becomes green ammonia, and it goes into the ammonia supply chain globally, and that's really used to make fertiliser, so you effectively decarbonise the food chain. So if you're a large ammonia producer currently in the world, you've got a decarbonisation target in line with Paris commitments, and therefore you need to bring green ammonia from somewhere. And all we have to do in any project that we utilise green hydrogen in Australia is make sure that it's the cheapest green hydrogen in the world. It's not going to be the cheapest hydrogen in the world, but the cheapest green hydrogen. That's why I think this project's got some competitive advantages. And although the supply will probably not go to Europe, it's probably one of the few projects, if any, in Australia that is able to temporarily match electron production with hydrogen production, and that's a requirement for the EU taxonomy for achieving definition of green hydrogen. If you're creating hydrogen on the east coast, then you are pulling electricity from the grid, which is currently brown and green, and you're creating the greenness by buying LGCs. So this is a physically 100% renewable green hydrogen. So it'll have a very large solar farm. The solar farm is going to be built on the freehold land of Energy Corporation, one of the traditional owner groups. That hydrogen is then, that solar energy is then turned into electricity. We draw water out of fresh water resource at Lake Argyle, or just downstream of that. And one of the issues for all these large-scale hydrogen projects that we're seeing in Western Australia is that they don't have a fresh water resource, and so they're talking about building big desalination plants. That has two challenges. One is the capital cost, and the other is it's a big load you have to service as well, so it just adds to the cost of energy. So you draw on fresh water from this Lake Argyle. It's then converted to hydrogen. It's then put in a pipe, line packed all the way 30 kilometres to Wyndham, and we use the line pack to run ammonia 24/7, use the hydropower. And then it's stored there and exported from the port. Now, it's not bigger in scale. So, 900 megawatts would be the largest solar farm in the country, but it's not sort of bigger in the terms of projects you've seen like Asian Renewable Energy Hub, which is sort of 15 gigawatts. They're real moonshot. This is something we believe can be done relatively quickly because it's utilising a large amount of existing infrastructure. And in theory, because the 20 megawatts is demand constrained, very cheap energy for them. Unlike the East Coast, there isn't another customer there who can afford to pay more than what green hydrogen can afford. So green hydrogen, if you want to make it relatively competitive in the current market, you need to be buying energy at around $40 megawatt hour, $40 less megawatt hour. So that is possible with this project. It's got the second highest resource intensity in solar resource intensity in Pilbara. So that sort of gets you to around the $40 a megawatt hour. And utilisation of infrastructure stops other large-scale fixed costs being included in this first phase of the project. So we've done, so far done a scoping study. We're now applying for funding for the feasibility phase from ARENA, and the intention would be that would run for 12 or 18 months, so normal development cycle now. So what we'll be doing during that development phase is, because of the ownership model, we'll be doing all the technical work, the environmental work, and also starting to draft up all the land lease agreements and all the Indigenous land use agreements, the commercial land agreements and the villages, and all the heritage approvals at the same time, and that will be taken to the market as a product which they will then effectively bid on. Now, there are a number of interested strategic investors who will be both the funders of the large-scale capital phase, as well as off-takers. And the CapEx is something like this, to the order of $3 billion of current rates for solar and high-end process plant. And this location that you can see, we're right up in the top north-east of Western Australia. It's on, this is quite brown, this is next to the ocean, this is Cambridge Gulf, this is Port here. This is Lake Argyle, the top of Lake Argyle. This is where the power station is. That line runs off to the diamond line. This line has a narrow solar farm. It's very well down here. So it's a relatively straightforward engineering project. We don't have any benchmarks yet for green hydrogen in Australia, and we don't have any benchmarks yet for traditional owner led and majority owned businesses. So we are setting some new benchmarks here, but we're pretty confident that the model will be one that will be is certainly impactful, and that sort of goes to the whole thing of what pollination is about. We are trying to change the way that we've done so that we can get to zero with them. So I think that's probably all I want to say now. Happy to sort of try to answer questions. Hasn't been out.
Does anyone have any questions for Rob?
Just going to ask about the $40 annual hour. What is that assuming 100% asset utilization electrolytes, or is it based on solar?
Yeah, so that's based on the utilisation factor that you get from, say, a 27% capacity factor of a solar farm. So you're trading off lower utilisation of electrolysis against not having to do fixed costs for resale. That's probably a trade-off. So everything, the theme has been, well, if you've got to fully utilise your electrolyzers because they're a high cost, and that is true. Electrolyzers are sort of like solar panels 12 years ago. You know, something like really expensive, and we bought these, and it's a bit the same as wind. I think I bought the first wind PPA in 2020 for Codrington, and it was $110 megawatt hour, and thermal energy was 45. And everyone's like, oh, I don't know what we're doing. So we've been there before, so we know where electrolysis is going to go once we get economies of scale in manufacturing. But yes, you are trying to deal with the high fixed cost of electrolysis at the moment by high utilisation. But it's just one element of the CapEx which, in the end, we can live with, given the other benefits of the layout of the project, we believe.
You mentioned the CapEx costs, and I thought I missed Rich's. Did you repeat that?
About three something billion. So 1,000 megawatts of solar, 1.1 village adds costs for location. Paper wash processes are sort of also modular. So again, it's about 225,000 tonnes of ammonia per annum. The sort of average size ammonia plant globally is 8,000 tonnes. So there are some economies of scale in a smaller plant, but the OEMs are responding to things.
You did explore a lot of end use cases in ammonia production for hydrogen, but what are your thoughts on say hydrogen's potential to burn off the grid? So for instance, gas blending into gas gigs.
Couldn't be the worst idea in the brain.
Oh, really?
Putting it back. Look, I think so. Gas blending is really good. The major component for gas blending, major component of blending green hydrogen into the gas network is the owners of the gas network who is trying to extend their existence. So yeah, we electrify everything first. The question is, do you need gas? Maybe barbecue.
The one thing I'd say is that we had a study published in Energy Journal last year. There is certainly a role for something that looks like the technology we're talking about. The question is, what's the cost trade-off? So I think to Rob's point, you would never pump hydrogen through a gas network. It makes no sense at all. Hydrogen is also prohibitively expensive to store. So if you compare what the OEMs are working on globally with an ammonia turbine or a hydrogen turbine, kind of send you some information. The levelized cost is still very, very high for the ammonia. It's heaps lower than the hydrogen because you don't have the storage costs. So if you look at, say, some of those customer markets, I find fascinating because Japan wants ammonia for power generation right now. So there's all kinds of thoughts that if you don't have lots of renewable resources, ammonia, it's effectively, stored version of our renewable resource export. So I wouldn't rule anything in or out at this point. I'd say the technology is developing, but certainly in the Australian market, there is absolutely a role. 2% of that very last decarbonisation, that looks something like a technology that will use ammonia.
And the round trip efficiency at the moment, anyway, of going electron, molecule, electron, feels like going back to predators and then generators. So I think we looked at a project in the Pilbara, and I think it was the equivalent of burning $40 individual gas in terms of cost versus what we were buying it for from the Northwest Shelf at that $4. So, yeah, the 10 times multiplier, if you're going gas, electron, gas. It'll be the last thing we do at hydrogen.
Except in South Australia. Thanks to the South
Yeah,
Australian
they're going to, yeah, that's, well,
they get
yeah. I think we need to
proof
get
of concept.
Yeah, we're trying to get the flywheel spun up on learning by doing, and I still look at that a bit like the solar flagships.
Yeah, exactly.
Who knows, right? And that was praised at the time. And while I spent all this money, 1.2 billion on 3 projects, and look where we are, right? So,
Anything happen. On your project, a couple of questions. Have you what's the capex penalty for such a remote location? What's the sort of costing of the 130 kilometre hydrogen pipe? What's your hydrogen storage strategy? And why not wind there as well to bump your electrolyser utilisation rate up?
it's the LCOE of wind, the capacity factor up there is so far north. Yeah, but the capacity factor is so low that it's
Wind
the
speed.
LCOE of wind is higher than solar, even. So you're just adding in more expensive energy by putting it, even though you might get the diurnal benefit. Now, we'll have a look at it during the feasibility assessment. Certainly for the south, once you get to sit down past Broome, then you're starting to look at better diurnal benefits and increasing capacity factor. The hydrogen gets stored in the pipe, so the only place the hydrogen never gets stored is in the pipe. But line packs. So you make lots of hydrogen in a day, you store it in the pipe, and it's making a bit of ammonia during the day and running the rest of the time on hydrogen power. And the capex of the pipe will. The project's not private, it's not public yet. We'll do a public announcement in early May, but we've obviously been out doing a bunch of stakeholder engagement in Western Australia, but it hasn't been. It's unpublished.
Sorry, just that pipe idea, it's actually rather interesting because storage of hydrogen is the problem for 130 kilometres of pipe. Build it fast enough that is your store.
Yeah.
So you get to run the ammonia plant at full speed.
Yeah, I think that's probably the solution. I think there's a solution for Western Australia. Everyone's got this idea of I'm going to build a giga project and have my own ports. It's sort of very resourced mentality. I'm going to have my own port, I'm going to have my own rail line. What they should be doing is doing the same as when they had the Bunbury moment, which is, look, we're going to start a whole new industry. So everybody, we're going to build a hydrogen pipe from wherever we want to start it, so maybe it's called Broome, and run it all the way to Banana. Everyone's just going to put the hydrogen in the pipe all the way down on this really high resource intensity. Even some offshore wind potentially. But the cost impost of trying to build ports in Western Australia is far higher than sort of just being on land remotely. And then these sales are probably because of there anyway. It's a bit weird at the moment. I don't think any of these people get up very quickly.
What about the HPC position or aspect of the analysis?
But I see she
No one
had
else
it up
is
there in
use
the
it.
past with the other ones. Same one.
Yeah, because
So the
the first case, yeah.
That was train and
Train.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the state want to lean into being green hydrogen, the state they do the same thing. We will underwrite the Dampier Bunbury equivalent for hydrogen, and then there'll be open access to put gas in.
Which is really good.
Yeah, and then once they've done that, you then sell it up to the private sector. Sort of raise for pipelines.
One last question. I just wanted to know, how will your First Nations partners benefit? What can they expect from being part of this project, being involved? Why is this worth their time?
So they get, traditionally, they get whatever royalty they can negotiate by holding, and potentially some contract and employment opportunities. This one they're getting learning by doing at the front end. They will get the development fee that all developers get when they're bringing the projects to the investors that wants to do the capital phase. They'll share in that. So that's a much bigger multiplier than a royalty income. And they should also, we've also created an option for them to invest in the project as well at par. There are quite a few philanthropic organisations that will put money into PBCs as their equity contribution. And they can get these sort of ongoing ownership rights and dividends as any other shareholder would. So we're trying to structure it up in a way that does help them build, sort of some cash flow now and then ongoing balance sheet development, which is sorely missing. The social deficit mindset is always on. We're always applying for money. And it's the same thing industry funds just stood up. The workers all have to hang on to being members of unions. It's the only way they get a few crumbs and shekels. But when they set up industry funds and they become the owners of the assets, there's sort of their superannuation funds. Completely change the role and participation as workers. And that's why unionism is way down. Because workers actually sharing in the wealth of the people.
It's just ownership and the production. Was also mentioned in the railway pipelines.
It depends. I mean, the asset, actually would make more sense for a big institutional investor to own the solar farm and get low cost of equity there. And then, the process plant would be better like someone like the Yarra or, who already makes ammonia and is expert in ammonia. So they probably would be broken up in bits, I think, contracted. But, their opportunity to participate, the MG might say, well, I want to be a shareholder of the solar farm. That's fine. Freehold and the nature of one of them. That would all be determined as we go through the development process and they get to the position. And then, the economics has got to support the participation. They get to co-decide, co-design this.
You can see why we needed to have them here. Really cutting edge, exciting project. Thank you very much, Rob. That was excellent. So please join me for the results. Let's continue all these discussions at lunch. I'm going to bring you back again, strictly, I'm sorry, at 1:30. At 1:30, we've actually got an international expert zooming in, and then we have some more presentations. So 1:30 back in the room, and we'll go to lunch.